EastEnders, The Moon Dilemma. Read by Tom Gardiner. This story features original characters Kat and Alfie Moon, Zoe Slater, Stacey Slater, Bianca Butcher, and Mo Harris as played by Shane Ritchie, Jessie Wallace, Michelle Ryan, Lacey Turner, Patsy Palmer, and Layla Morse on the BBC TV soap EastEnders. Chapter 1. Zoe's Regret. Daylight had arrived too quickly for Zoe Slater. She awoke one morning to find herself staring in direct sunlight as the beautifully glistening sun shone in her eyes from the open window of her bedroom in her home. She could not get any focus in her eyes because it was so bright. She found herself in an awkward position. She was laying on her king-size bed as her legs were hanging off the mattress and her head laid between the gap of two very feathery pillows. She had felt a little drowsy, so she could not get focus on what was surrounding her at all. There was a ticking noise ringing in her head, and she could hear it loudly. It sounded as if someone was trying to signal her that time was running out. But what Zoe didn't know was that time actually was running out. Zoe couldn't remember exactly what happened to her and how she ended up on the bed, feeling in such pain as she did, but somehow, some memories were coming back to her. Now Zoe knew exactly what she had done. She took a gulp and regretted it. Every single moment. During the previous night, Zoe and her friend Sheila had been invited out to a housewarming party to celebrate Sheila's 25th birthday. It had been planned for nearly a month between the group of friends that Zoe enjoyed hanging out with, and the villa which the party was held in was certainly booming with wild adults. Zoe was in her element as she danced all night long. She'd even met a few guys, but what happened to Zoe later that evening after she had a few drinks changed her life forever. She decided to walk home back to her and Sheila's villa alone because she needed the space, but Zoe wasn't aware of the danger she was in. She made the decision to invite a gentleman home to the villa and that she would meet him halfway. Despite strong words from Sheila that she was making a big mistake, Zoe blatantly ignored her and left the party with a smile on her face. Once she had stumbled a few times but slowly made her way down the small dim alleyway a couple of metres south from where the party commenced, she sang to herself. Bottle of whiskey in one hand, whilst her sparkly pink bag was in the other. She looked down on the pavement, trying her hardest not to fall over, giggling at every little hiccup between the words she was singing. The alleyway was so little lit that she barely could focus on the pavement, but she did see something, in fact, someone. She looked ahead of her now, and found a figure hiding themselves from any light, but standing and looking in her direction. She could not see whether they were male or female, but as she walked closer to them, she came to a halt by a dumpster bin and stared directly at them, only a few feet away. They had stood in total silence, but Zoe was trying to focus on their face. She had drunk so many bottles of whiskey that evening, she was surprised she could even stand. Again, total silence for another minute, yet still the figure stared at her. Zoe began to wonder whether it was the lad she had asked to meet. So she did not hesitate to ask the stranger a question any more. She stood on the spot and began to shiver. Though Spain was not as cold at night, she felt a chill and started to doubt walking alone. Then she began to speak, with no clue she had just made the biggest mistake ever. Hello? Anton? Is that you? Stop playing the silly Zoe couldn't finish speaking. The figure had grabbed her by her arms and her throat. The figure pushed her to the dumpster, and slowly Zoe was starting to gasp for air. She couldn't move any part of her body because whoever was hurting her had a firm grip on her neck and arm, and she dropped her heavy handbag on her feet, so she struggled to fight back. The figure began to speak. This revealed to Zoe that it had been a gentleman, but it was not the same voice as the young, kind-seeming lad that she had invited to the villa earlier that night. "You're going to listen to me, girl, and you're going to do something for me." The figure's stern voice frightened Zoe. "Whether you like it or not." Zoe couldn't remember nothing of the previous night. She could only vividly remember getting ready to head to the party. She at least managed to sit herself up from where she laid on the bed and sat thinking. It had been all a blur to her, but there was one thing Zoe didn't understand. She couldn't hear a single person making any movement around the villa, or no voices. This was very unusual for her, because usually there were about 6 or 7 girls wandering around, giggling and gossiping by the time dawn had risen. Could Zoe have been on her own? She wondered this too, but she felt so weak, she didn't have the energy to bother checking or care about it. She just fell back on her bed again. But suddenly, another memory hit her. Something had happened to her last night. She remembered a room with a bright light. She remembered a deep voice. She couldn't quite make it out to herself yet, but she didn't need to bother anyway. The door to her villa bedroom opened as she heard the loud creak ring in her head, just like the ticking did. And the voice she tried to memorize in her head spoke again. This was not one of her memories. This voice was speaking to her at this moment, for real. I hope you're ready for what is planned. We cannot afford to lose the money. If we did, you know what sacrifices we must make. Now, Zoe remembered. She remembered everything, and nobody could hear her. But Zoe screamed the loudest she had ever done before. She wanted to be somewhere else right now. The one and only place she could think of was back home on Albert Square. Getting to live independently was one thing, but knowing you might never return home to see the ones you love was another.